Record. Hey, podcast listeners, welcome once again to Nonprofit Lowdown. Today, my guest is Latanya Mapp Frett, who is the new author of a book called The Everyday Feminist, The Key to Sustainable Social Impact Driving Movements We Need Now More Than Ever. She is also the president and CEO of the Global Fund for Women. Fun fact, she was also my boss when I was a little bitty intern over 20 years ago at UNICEF. So, Latanya, so good to connect. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ria. I love the way worlds collide and come back together. This is so cool to be able to do this with you today.
I know, it's so funny. You knew me as like a little 20-something intern, like fetching coffee and doing all the things. So it's really fun for us to
Yeah.
reconnect. So before we jump into the book, which is very, very
Mhm.
exciting, congratulations. I
Thank
just
you.
about yourself and your career, which has been very interesting, international. You've done many, many things. So where did it all begin for you?
Ria, it's a great question because it is, just it goes right back to your family. I mean, we were talking earlier about growing up in the Bay Area. I grew up in Philadelphia, and both of my grandparents, my maternal and paternal grandparents, were very active in their communities. They gave back all the time. So you kind of grow up not knowing that it's anything different or special, but you give back. You're part of a community wherever you are, and I've taken that with me in more than 15 countries. I've lived in 4 continents over my career, and I've partnered with, all of these different types, whether they're NGOs or the United Nations or governments and foundations. And for me, it always landed on one thing. I wanted to give back, and I really wanted to advance gender justice. Social equality, sort of the big, thing that you want to change. You want everything to be equal and people treated fairly around the world. And so it was easy for me. It came easy to kind of end up in this world where I'm doing international development and philanthropy and some supporting communities, and in particular women in communities. Because in every single country I've lived in, every single organization I've been in, there was always this, everyday feminist, right? There was this activist that was creating this kind of change. And I was always in awe of how they moved and how they acted and how it was just so easy for them. And they befriend you and they teach you and they help you and you learn, right? And for me, that was like a part of my power, was the ability to be able to find these women and to become friends with them. And so now, I mean, quite frankly, in my career, I think I ended up as the president and CEO of this organization. But it's been a wonderful ride, to get here, and all while doing what I love the most, and what my grandmothers would say is what my duty is, to give back to my community. So I feel like that's kind of how it started, and that's where it's ending, because I guess I got another good decade in me, work wise, but I do feel like that it's been a wonderful ride, and I think you can stay committed to what you want to do, give back, and have a wonderful career.
Yeah, I love that. And your career is actually so inspiring for me when I was I think I was 20 years old and I was working for you. And I was like, Latanya's career is so cool. I mean, at the time we were both in Ethiopia. And
Yeah.
actually I remember one of the assignments you sent me out on was to look at the different projects that UNICEF was funding. And consistently the ones that seemed to do the best were microcredit loans to women. I was like, why don't we just give
Mhm.
all the money to the women to figure all this stuff
Yeah.
out? So talk to me a little bit about what you mean by everyday feminists.
Yeah. So I mean, I write about this in the book because it's I think the terminology has gotten to where, depending on what camp you're from, it could be very corrosive or it could be incredibly empowering, feminist. And I really wanted to kind of, bring this into a setting where, when I talk about everyday feminists, I am talking about these women and their organizations and their movements, and sometimes they're men, because I want to put that out there. A lot of times you do find men who are doing this special kind of work to really set strategies around their issues. And their issues are not just women's issues, right? These are issues for society. These are women who are trying to change the narrative. They're trying to change the systems. I mean, right now, if I should do a blog like Everyday Feminist of the Week or something, because right now I just watched Mia Motley's speech in Paris, and I'm like, she's definitely my Everyday Feminist for the week, because these are people who just aren't afraid to speak what they know to be true. They're not afraid to move their lived experiences into the halls of power, into the rooms where the money sits, and talk about what's required for us to have a better world. So when I'm talking about everyday feminists, these are the women I'm talking about, and they don't need notoriety to stand on the stage like Mia Motley, right? All they need is any kind of platform to bring justice to their communities. And so I really wanted us to have a book where we talk about how do we support them, right? How do we get out of their way so they could do this work, but make sure they have the resources, because all revolutions are financed. I don't care which one, and they need the support behind them to be able to continue to tackle these really, really, really challenging issues. And quite, to me, it's like they're looking at the long-term impact, while a lot of us are sort of stuck on the short term. What can we do? They're looking at, what does my community and my country look like, 10, 20, 30 years from now? And I think that's what matters. And that's why I talk about movements that we need now, because we need to figure out a future that looks better than, quite frankly, right now we can see.
I want to talk a little bit about inequities in philanthropy. When we look across the board, at least here domestically, and I haven't seen the statistics for internationally, but we know that women are not funded at the same rate as men philanthropically, and we know people of color, and specifically Black women, are not funded at the same rate as white-led organizations. So I'm wondering, how are you thinking about, you know, I don't know if it's changing the conversation, or at least bringing it to light that many of the everyday feminists that you are advocating for are women of color?
Yeah. So let me just start with one piece of it, which is that, these, I don't speak for these women. These women are not out here begging for scrapes, right? They're trying to change the way it works. And so Mia Motley is a great example, but think about Lima Gaboe, who is a, Nobel Peace Prize winner from Liberia. And people know her story from Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which was done by Abby Disney some years ago. But it was the story of a woman who worked amongst women in her community, and they were tired of civil war in Liberia, right? And they were like, just, they've got to do something. They didn't have organizations behind them. They were just coming from the community and just didn't want any more deaths, and wanted to stop the killing. And she needed money to take buses over to the peace talks in Accra. And so Global Fund for Women gave her, I think it was like 10,000. That was the first check. And she used that 10,000 to take those buses over to Accra. And those women, if you remember, chained themselves around that building and would not let those men, because it was all men up there in the peace talks, would not let them out of the room until they came up with a peace agreement. And that's the kind of thing that, we're talking about. When I write the book, I'm really trying to draw attention to, it doesn't take much for these women to do what's necessary, to get the job done. And we're not even giving them that. We're giving them such a small amount of funding. The latest study showed that only 1.9% of all funding, and so we're looking at all overseas funding to global South countries, makes it to organizations dedicated to women and girls. So we're talking about grassroots organizations in their community. And so I know when I've said this before, people are always like, it can't be that small. It's that small. It's not even 2% of all the money gets to them. And then you could slice that with Black feminist social movements, which we just saw a report that says that it's 0.5%. So half of 1% of philanthropic dollars is getting to these women of color who are just doing amazing work. And I know people are like, so why does it matter? Why are we counting these pennies? Because there is a direct correlation between the support that we give to these movements and outcomes that we don't want. I remember when I was in Egypt at that time with USAID, and we had such a difficult time. I was running the program office, but such a difficult time getting the government to allow us to support local human rights groups. Now, I mean, people might not be surprised at that, but normally USAID does offer some funding to small local groups, especially ones in their democracy portfolios. But, skip ahead 3 years and then Arab Spring happened. All messy, depending on how you look at it. It was an opportunity for civil society to stand up. But because they didn't have that support, they hadn't been funded, they hadn't been taken care of in those years leading up to that, they really didn't have the resources necessary to make the change I think that they were trying to see happen after the Arab Spring. And so, for those that know Egyptian history much more, about modern history anyway, much better than I do, know that the steps that happened afterwards were sort of diminishing, and civil society continues to close in Egypt. So, those opportunities are only going to happen once in a lifetime. We've got to resource them, and we got to get behind these women who are doing this work so that we can see the systemic changes that we know needs to happen. I know that was long-winded. I'm sorry
No,
for
no,
that.
no, no. I mean, that's really helpful because I think, we talk about funding feminist movements and, and funding women doing systemic work, but really it's it's work for all of society, right? Because I think we can point to the fact that, like, when we put resources in the hand of women, when we put resources in the hands of mother, we can see a very clear ROI, whether it's,
Right.
economy building, democracy building, and so forth. So I'm wondering, can you speak a little bit to some of the data that you've seen that supports this idea of, like, when we fund women, we're funding, the greater good?
You know who puts out some good data around this? This idea of making sure that we fund, women, because they then use that money to fund their children's education, to fund community work that's happening, and then that then makes the community more able to participate and sort of and asks for resources from their government, and then their government has the ability to direct resources, right? So it's like a cycle that starts to happen when women get money, and it's normally almost never goes outside of that circle, so they're funding their children, their communities, their gardens, their farms, all the things that they're doing. And that's why the micro credit program was so successful in Ethiopia, right? So that this cycle was just happening. It makes the community, it makes the family better, the community better, the country better, and in the region better, and in the world better, right? And so most, and UN Women looks at this all the time. I will say though, something a little disappointing, Ria, that I just saw last week. You may have seen the UNDP report, that was actually looking at perceptions about women. And they were specifically looking at perceptions about women in politics, business, and work generally in 80 countries. But that number, 9 out of 10 people are biased, right? So basically, they're saying men are better at politics, men are better at business, and men are better at work. It's very disappointing because we've seen so many great achievements over the last few decades that women have given. And so, in talking about that cycle, you would think it would have improved perceptions, coming from people. And don't be fooled, these are not just men being surveyed, these are women too, right? So we do have a big jump that we need to move from rhetoric around gender equality, where everyone's like, yeah, women and women are equal, to what actually is happening in the reality. I mean, we look at it from development assistance in my organization towards gender equality, and we're seeing that it's flatlined. So at the same time that everyone is saying, even with climate justice, right, this week in Paris, that women are actually the ones who are doing the work for mitigation and adaptation. So why is that not matching the resources getting to them, right? So lawmakers are talking all of this stuff, but they're still, you see it, curtailing, bodily autonomy is one of them, but even just human rights defenders, women are still experiencing all these violence in their communities, on their websites, so all of these things, though, we really have to get at. So we know, we've proven that it works. The cycle of giving women more makes more happen, but we somehow are not getting people to realize that they need to put their money where their mouths are.
Yeah, that's so important. So, I mean, to that point, How do we start to shift that? Because I think particularly if we're looking at organizations funded by women, it's less than 2% uh, of all giving, as you said, and then 0.5% for Black women-led organizations. We know that, unconscious bias is real. We know that, particularly in a cultural context, there are probably
Mhm.
cultural things that we are up against as well. What do we do? Like, what would the advice be for an individual person running an organization that's trying to get resources to do the work?
Yeah, I was just on this call, in the UK, talking about childcare, and how we support families that need childcare. And one of the things that, was commented on is this active listening. It's the nature of policymakers, and I have my master's in public policy too, but it's the nature of policymakers to try to find solutions, and we love that. But what we're trying to engage also in the development community, also in the feminist communities, is that should not happen without active listening with the communities. Because the assumption that there's a one size fits all on any of these issues that we're talking about, I feel like we've already passed that day, where you sit in Washington D.C. or New York or whatever, London, whatever capital in the world, and come up with programs for communities, and then sort of give it to them, quote unquote. I felt like we had already had those conversations and already discovered that that's not the way it works. The way it's going to work is that you're going to have to include the communities on the solutions that affect them. It seems so simple, but for some reason, it's very difficult for us to get our head around. Governments, philanthropy, corporations, and asking what we can do, how we can be of service to these, everyday feminists, is the question that I'm interested in us asking, because it's not enough to come up with a solution then that wasn't created by them and expect them to sort of fill in the gaps and make it happen and be successful. So at Global Fund for Women, we use a mix of things, right? So we use data. I'm very much supportive of using data. But you have to mix that with on the ground insights, right? So what we do is we have a couple of things. We call it a data hub, a gender justice data hub, where we take all of this data, and including AI. I know AI, gets a bad rap, especially now with Chat GPT, but we use AI the same way you would shopping for shoes, right? So when you hear noise over the internet, over social media, about actual feminist movements coming, emerging, then we want to take that data and then we want to move it into the field to advisors and ask them. We have more than 300 advisors across the world. What's happening? Can we be in support of this emerging movement and actually get funding to those movements when they need it, right at that moment? So that's the kind of thing that I think is going to be important. It's like sort of showing up when we're needed, instead of coming up with all these programs and stuff and then saying, okay, send me a proposal on how you fit into my program, right? It's like find out what's happening at the time using data and other machine resources, and then ground truth that with communities and do some active listening on what is necessary. So that's where I see us, utilizing where we are in society to really help more and to change this narrative around the way that we fund feminist movements.
So, as you're talking, it occurs to me, when you use the term feminist movement, it's not a
Mhm.
monolith, right? And I think that term can mean lots of different things to lots of different people, depending on, cultural frameworks and so forth. So when we think about feminist movements, is it like how would you define it? Is it specifically movements that are led by women? Is it specifically movements that have a gender equity agenda? Like, what do you mean when you say feminist movement?
So yeah, and it's a great point. Thanks, Ria. Because I'm of course talking about the work that we do at Global Fund for Women when I talk about feminist movements, where we do kind of narrow the playing field a little bit. But we are talking about movements that are either led by women in their communities and or movements that are focused on feminist issues. And as you know, that's a broad intersectional. So like climate is a feminist issue, and from where I stand, right? It may not be for everyone, but those are the way that's the way we think about it. That's the way we talk about it at Global Fund for Women, because it's super important not to get caught up in this language around, whether it's a womanist movement or something else. And yes, it is a womanist movement too, right? But so what we're trying to figure out is how do we make sure that these organizations that we support are not just hopefully led by women, but also addressing issues that are important to women in the communities where they live. And so that's why I use the terminology feminist movements when I talk about the funding that we need to get out to them. But we look at it like artists. We have a group called Artist Changemakers, and they're very much involved with feminist movements around the world. May not necessarily even be women, right? They could be any category of genders. We have what we call the Adolescent Girls Advisory Group, and these are young girls between the ages of 14 and 21 who we want to support younger. I mean, a lot of the climate work, as you probably know, is actually getting started by young girls
I
around the
know
world.
it's really incredible, and
It
I am
is
here for it.
inspiring.
Yeah.
Yeah, inspiring. Yep.
So when we think about everyday people, like everyday feminists, but like everyday people. And I'm sitting here and I'm like, Latanya, yes, I want to be a part of this. I want to fund, feminist movements and support my everyday feminists. What can I as a person do in support of this movement?
Mm. I do. So I do talk about this in the book, especially in the conclusion, because I am asking of individuals, and individuals are the people that make up all of these organizations, whether that's in philanthropy, government, or corporate. But I am asking that we embrace and value the slow path to real lasting change, because I think that is what everyday feminists have to do. They don't get up in the morning and say, today I'm going to change everything. It is the life that they live. It is getting up every morning, moving towards change. And I think sometimes for individuals, and I know we used to have, and I hope we're moving away from this, but these discussions around, oh, what kind of impact are you making? Show me your numbers. How many people did you talk to today? Or how many, all of this sort of nonsense that really doesn't mean anything, but that we get wrapped up because we have built an industry and how this works, right? I'm asking that we actually, and many do already, but that we really value what lasting change looks like, and stick with everyday feminists through the natural ups and downs of movement work. And so it's like not to have a flavor of the day, but to have a passionate partner in the work that you're thinking about in your community or communities that you care about around the world. And it's important that I say that, because I think the way that we think about giving and supporting is sometimes built around honestly, the flavor of the day. But if you take it up a notch, right, and you say, okay, so now that's what individuals do. They sort of find their passion, the organizations that represent that, and are trying to make change and stick with them over time, and to see that change actually materialize. I'm then saying to governments, people make up governments too. So if you're working in government, and whether it's bilateral or multilateral, it doesn't really matter. I ask that we actually protect everyday feminists who are in many ways serving as human rights defenders everywhere. Because I don't think we have enough no tolerance policies for countries that don't comply. So we do these sanction things. I mean, you could look at Russia, or you can, a host of examples that we can use. But I do think that it's far too often just okay that women are doing this work and don't have any kind of protection, and are often hurt, maligned, and then sometimes killed, and just in the duty of being an everyday feminist and working for their community. So I am asking that we have a no tolerance for that. And I think so it means when a woman is killed just because she's a woman and speaking up for women issues, that we actually as individuals resist that, and literally push back with our governments when that happens. And for corporates and business, let me just say, I think, we started doing this a little bit around George Floyd's murder, but I feel like a lot of it was rhetoric and a lot of things started and then ended and didn't continue. But we do need to clarify what our values are, especially in capitalist structures, right? What are the values of the leadership that we're bringing in, their boards and their staff? Because we want to ensure that they listen to and partner, which is probably the most important thing, but listen and partner with everyday feminists. So I think there's a role for everyone, but I do think those three things are going to be super important, that we stick with the everyday feminists, that we protect them, and that then we clarify our values so that we can partner with them.
Do you mind if I get a little bit more personal here?
Sure.
So in your career, I mean, you've had very impressive leadership roles. Have you also been in the seat of having to do fundraising?
Yes, I do fundraising. I mean, in some ways, I've always done it, but I'll just go backwards. So at Global Fund for Women, we are a foundation, a fund, which means that what we raise is what we use to give money. So not unlike foundations that have like endowments or are
Mm-hmm.
banked by a billionaire, right? So we are a public foundation, raise money to give money. So yes, I've been doing that since I've been with this organization. And even before that, I was with Planned Parenthood Global. And we absolutely raised everything. We use the phrase, we eat what we kill. So we
Yeah,
are, naturally out there, every year, starting from zero
I
and raising.
know. Just
But
feels like
even when
Sisyphus, like
I
pushing the
know
rock up the hill,
it's
right?
the exactly it's the NGO, way. But I would say that even when I was with the U.S. government, there was a big piece of my work that I did, which we used to call the partnership office. And the partnership office was, what we PPPs, public-private partnerships. And so it wasn't the same as like raising money, but it was really seeking to be in partnership with private sector to get work done. In fact, when I was in Nigeria, we worked with Shell, which was an extractive in that country, to work in the Delta area, but actually putting money towards community. And I was sort of at the cusp of that. Now it's more normal to see that happening, but when I had started back in Nigeria, it wasn't as normal. And Shell actually combined resources with USAID, 25 million, in order to ensure that livelihood work that was happening in the Delta was actually benefiting those directly in the communities where they were working. So this kind of concept of fundraising I've been doing for quite some time. And even when we were together, I don't know if you remember, I was actually raising money from USAID to do the Street Children program
Oh,
there.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
I was like a little intern. I didn't know the whole context.
Yeah.
Um, talk to me about this because I'm imagining that folks are listening to you, particularly women of color, particularly Black women, and thinking like there's a lot uh that comes with having to be on the front line of fundraising, right? And whether it's microaggressions, unconscious bias, assumptions about who and what you are based on how you look and your lived experience. So I'm just curious for yourself as a successful fundraiser, how have you been able to sustain yourself when, we're looking at the stats and it's kind of stacked against you, not you personally, but like against women of color in general.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. And I mean, I see it, I feel it often. Personally, and of colleagues that look like me, we get into these roles, and despite how we tend to over deliver, still people don't trust your vision. Still, you have to convince people that you know what you're doing. It does get tiring, especially when you see someone, especially a white male, doing very similar things, and people are lauding them as the next, whatever, right? And when you do it, it's just like, oh yeah, well, she's okay. That kind of thing. But I can't, I, you know, I can't, and I'm assuming many of my colleagues who are like me really can't dote on that. We can't spend a whole lot of time. What I've done since I've joined Global Fund for Women, which we just had our top grant making year in the history of the
Oh,
organization.
congratulations.
We're not
Wonderful.
even at the end of the fiscal year, but we're already at like close to $29 million in the field this year. I'm, super, super excited about that. I think our highest before that was 17 million. And part
Amazing.
of that was
Congratulations.
a partnership, right, with other feminists. So one of the things that we're doing is fiscal sponsorship with the Black Feminist Fund, with other sister funds that are regional and national around the world. Afro-Latina, Black women leaders, We Can't Breathe. So these are just some of the partnerships. So, and I think you understand fiscal sponsorship, because I think you talked about it at the show, but it's just bringing their brand into Global Fund for Women and saying, hey, what you're doing is worthwhile. You are amazing. You are doing God's work. Go out there and do it, and we'll take care of the back end. So, for all of those smaller NGOs that have to really deal with all of these sort of legal and financial and compliance issues, we're saying, let us take care of that for you, and you just go do the work that women need. And so I think together, from my perspective, it's been, how do I do that better? How do I do more of that? And how do we see us, together bringing more funding to the gender justice world? And so I'm excited that has worked. And so, we just have to keep getting innovative, and despite the naysayers and what they think and their unconscious biases, we have to move beyond that and keep doing the work that's required for the world.
So if I could unpack that, because I think that's really powerful, is, A, kind of acknowledging that it's there, but not dwelling on it and moving forward anyway, and B, creating community to sustain. Is that right?
Absolutely right. And we honestly have done better together on these issues than we could ever do separately. So I am a huge, huge component on where you see opposition, draw closer to your allies so that you can win.
Yeah, I love that. So, I mean, I'm imagining that being an everyday feminist and running a movement is not an easy task, right? I think women, there's so much that we know about the inequities in, the domestic responsibilities, plus the professional world, plus now we have this movement building that we're doing. How have you seen your everyday feminists sustain themselves through it? Because look, I get it. Women will find 27 hours in a day to get all the things done, but at a certain point, you can't pour from an empty cup. So how are you seeing some of these feminists really sustain themselves over time?
Yeah, it's true. And I kind of make a little fun in the book when I talk about some of the places where I've met these everyday feminists and how gorgeous they look. They spend, they're doing all this work and they still come about, looking amazing. But one of the things that I think you will find for most of these women, they are actually using their own resources to do this work. And so many of them are and probably all of them are very entrepreneurial, right? So it's not that they're just out there, trying to get at these issues. They're also trying to resource it, right? So I talk in the book about Innocent, who owned a braiding salon in Nairobi, a very popular braiding salon at the time that I was there. And she was using all of this money that she's making at the salon, doing all kind of stuff, but she was also selling stuff. She was selling contraceptions, to clients. She was just moving in these dynamic ways that will both bring income, but then using that income to fund the movement. And so I think so many of the women that, especially that I talk about in the book, but everywhere I've been, are doing that. They're thinking about not just how, we can keep this movement alive, but also how do we fund it? How do I fund myself? We were just in Barbados with the fisher folk, women vendors for fish there. They have all these great ideas about, how they can get into new sectors. As you know, the fish is being depleted because of climate change. And so, they're thinking, what's next? How do we continue to, have an income? How do we have a business now that we're seeing these changes in our climate? And so, for me, I know it's not easy for them, but I have seen the most entrepreneurial women doing this work. They not only bring money to feed their families, which is primary, but they also then use that money to feed literally the movement.
So that's really interesting because you've cited a couple of international examples that are kind of like, philanthropic, but also income producing or revenue producing. Is that a trend that you're seeing, internationally and seeing more of? Because I think in the American context, I mean, certainly we've seen, for profit and revenue generating entities, but generally with nonprofits, we're seeing like, you're either sort of philanthropically funded or, you're a for profit. And so
Mhm.
I guess my question is like, do you see more of a hybrid trend taking place?
Well, I don't know about taking place. I think it's just been the way it is. I mean, think about it, right? So, in most of the countries where we work, the informal sector is where most women are. So, we have numbers, some countries that go as high as 60 to 70%. But, on average, even in like, neighboring Caribbean countries, right? 40 to 50% of the women are in the informal sector, business sector, I'm saying. So, they're making their money off of these small enterprises, right? In the US, we kind of have the privilege of being able to, because there is not as many people in the informal sector here, to be able to distinguish this, for profit and not for profit thing that we do here. It is a privilege. I mean, and I hope we realize that, because in many parts of the world, most parts of the world, there is not that privilege. The difference between nonprofit and for profit is just a thin, thin line, and it depends on what you have to eat today. And that's why over COVID, right, it was a real challenge. You tell people to stay home, but they have to, literally going back to that saying, they have to eat what they kill that day. And so by not being able to go out and bring in funds means that you may not be eating and your family may not be eating. So it's not a trend. I think it's the way it is for most places in the world, is that women have had to be entrepreneurial. They have had to really lean into the informal sector to make sure that they bring, the required resources into their homes.
So when we think about, and I'm just thinking about myself as like one person, when we think about the scope of, everyday feminists globally, that feels like such a big, thing, right? It's huge. Like, what can I as one person do? So, for someone like myself who wants to make an impact, who wants to make a difference, I'm not a billionaire, but I want to do something. How would you recommend, like, should I start small? Should I start domestically? Should I start, with one country? Like what's the way in which an individual can make a difference?
Yeah. And so I think, I mean, other than changing your mindset about this, which is, back to the UNDP report and what I'm asking of people to really take the slow path in their philanthropy, because everyone is a philanthropist when you give. But I would say liken it to an issue like climate change, right? Enormous. But critical, right? And it's like you just as an individual are just trying to figure out, how do I sort of stem what we're seeing happening? And I think everyone is going to find those little actions that they can take in order to actually make a difference in their own hearts, right? And with their own vision. And I think that's super special. And I think that we just have to do some self-analysis to figure out what that is. What's meaningful for you, Ria, may not be the same as what's meaningful for me, but we both around the climate, and I'm using climate because I think it might be a little easier for people than gender justice to kind of visualize, but we're both doing something, right now in our everyday lives that we are hoping will change the tide for where we're headed for climate. But then, because of the enormity of the challenge, right, and the urgency, we also are looking at ways that we can give modestly, right? And I think whether that's in your community, to a group that's looking at climate and trying to make some changes, your school, and I think giving more resources is going to be very important for all of us, whether that's $1 or $1,000,000. I think we know we have to do everyday actions, but plus we have to give, because that's the only way we're going to disrupt the status quo. And so for us, like at Global Fund for Women, we give to local organizations, and I think if that do climate. right? That do other issues, that do intersectional range of issues. And I think if giving more resources is possible, then people, I think, should give to organizations that are really trying to get at the root of community issues as much as they can, because changing that power, and we talk about shifting power a lot, but changing that power between making your individual decisions around what you can do for climate and then what you do for your community is going to be very important as we try to tackle this really, really big problem. So I hope that wasn't too like esoteric, but really it's like making some decisions about what you can do in your own life, and then making some decisions about how you can give to organizations that are really trying to tackle that problem.
Yeah. And I think that's right too, that to not be intimidated by the enormity of the issue, to do something is better than to do nothing, right? Because I do
Yeah.
think that there's this, kind of fight, flight, freeze idea of like, oh gosh, this is so big. I can't do anything, whether it's climate change, whether it's gender justice, whether it's like, you know, education, you name it. Okay, last question for me. Again, congratulations on the book, having written a book. I know it's no small feat. Who should read this book? Who's it for?
So it's too easy to just say everyone, but I am really hopeful that first of all, people that are sort of challenged with this term around feminism, like literally people who are like, I am no feminist, or I don't like using that term because it's for white rich women. I hope they read it, because I think they'll end the book. By the time they finish the book, they'll have a changed sense of understanding around what it means to be a feminist, how to stand in feminist solidarity with others. And quite frankly, that you don't even have to call yourself a feminist to be supportive of the work that I'm talking about in the book. So other than that, though, I think, people who fund and resource this kind of work, so philanthropists, government, corporations, I hope they also read the book, because I think it gives some real practical examples of what it means to be in solidarity with and in partnership with everyday feminists and the work that they do in their countries, and kind of let you know how it kind of makes you think about how you appreciate the everyday feminists in your own world, your own community, your own schools. So I'm hoping that, people who are interested in gender justice issues generally and who fund them can actually read the book, so they can see some steps to how you move from supporting everyday feminists to actually resourcing the work that they do, and then a change transformative system for us all.
That is so great, and it's such an important call to action. We don't have any time to waste. I mean, the window is
Yeah,
closing on so many issues, particularly climate, that we have to act now. There's a sense of
yeah,
urgency. Latanya, thank you
absolutely.
so much. I'm going to make sure all of your info is in the show notes. Folks, go out, get this book to support the work, to support everyday feminists, to resource them,
Yeah.
but also to support my friend Latanya, who wrote a fantastic book. So, Latanya,
Thank you, Ria.
thank you so much.
Such a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you
I
so
know
much.
it's so nice to reconnect. So hopefully it won't be another 20 years. But
I doubt it. Yeah,
wait,
it's good. I'll keep up with you. Okay.
yeah, very good. And actually, I'm very much in support of you doing your Everyday Feminist weekly, because I think that would be so fun.
Um,
So if you get that
yeah.
started, let me know and I'll make sure to put it out over my platforms.
Well, thank you. I am thinking about it. Thank you so much. You take care.
Thank you.
Okay.
Take Bye bye.
All right. Bye bye.